world outside your window has gone quiet, and that's exactly when stories like this one feel most real. What you're about to hear comes from a police officer who thought he'd spend his career breaking up high school parties and writing speeding tickets. He wanted excitement. He wanted purpose. He got something else entirely. Something that defied explanation. This is a story about a sealed tunnel, about a teenager with a homemade bomb, about fog that doesn't move like fog should, and about the moment when everything familiar becomes something else. Before we begin, I need to remind you, the person who shared this account requested anonymity. The town remains unnamed, and there are still people who don't want this story told. But some stories refuse to stay buried. So turn down your lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't go looking for sealed tunnels and abandoned places. Let's begin. Settle in, turn down the lights. What you're about to hear may keep you up tonight. From the time I was young, I carried a vision with me. A vision of myself walking the crowded streets of some great American city, badge gleaming under streetlights, ready to make a difference. Programs like Forensic Files, shows like NYPD Blue, they painted a picture in my mind. I saw myself as someone who could stand between chaos and order, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But life, as it often does, had different plans. Instead of patrolling the dense neighborhoods of Brooklyn or navigating the sprawling blocks of Chicago, I found myself stationed in a place about as far from those dreams as you could imagine. A small town tucked away in the rural Midwest. The kind of place where dirt stretches endlessly in every direction, where tumbleweeds drift lazily across empty roads, and the horizon seems to go on forever without interruption. There's a comedian, his name slips my mind now, who once described living in a place like this with a single joke. He said you could sit on your front porch and watch your dog run away for 3 straight days. It's funny because it's true. The flatness, the emptiness, it swallows everything. I won't be sharing the name of this town. Not now, not ever. There are things that happened here recently, things I still don't fully comprehend. My superiors, they wouldn't take kindly to me speaking openly about any of this. Even posting what I'm about to tell you is probably crossing a line. But at this point, I don't know what else to do. Sometimes you need to share the weight you're carrying, even if it means risking consequences. When I first arrived and settled into the job, it became clear very quickly that excitement was in short supply out here. That was simply the way things were. Quiet, predictable, safe, if you want to call it that. But everything changed about a week ago. I was partnered with a fellow officer. We'll call him Doug. Doug had been with the same precinct for nearly 3 decades. He was the kind of man who moved through life at his own pace, never rushed, always cordial. Unless something truly urgent arose, he seemed content to take his time with just about everything. We were on our usual patrol route that evening. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Doug was in the middle of recounting one of his many stories, this one about the time he faced down a hungry cougar while trying to assist an injured camper. I loved listening to him. He had this whole collection of tales, and each one felt like a window into a life fully lived. It was shaping up to be just another ordinary evening. Then Doug guided our cruiser around a bend in what I can only describe as the most isolated section of our jurisdiction. A small valley surrounded by rolling foothills. Nobody ever ventured out there. There was simply no reason to. But as we rounded that corner, our headlights swept across something unexpected. A Jeep, parked on the shoulder directly in front of one of the hills. The driver's side door hung open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Our beams illuminated the interior, but there was no one inside. "Who the hell is this?" Doug muttered, pulling our vehicle over onto the opposite shoulder. We stepped out into the cooling evening air and approached the abandoned vehicle. The lights were off, but it was clear the Jeep hadn't been sitting there long. What struck me immediately as strange was that whoever had driven it here hadn't even bothered closing the door behind them. Doug took the lead as we moved closer. He called out to the missing driver. His voice echoed across the empty landscape, but no response came. His hand moved to rest on his holster as he crept forward. I stayed a few paces behind, watching his back, scanning the area around us. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no sounds. But something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand on end, that primal instinct warning me that we were walking into something we didn't understand. Part of me hoped we weren't about to discover someone's final moments. That was the vibe I was getting. That dark, heavy feeling that settles over a scene when tragedy has occurred. Doug reached the side of the Jeep and leaned in to peer through the open door. The moment he saw what was inside, he recoiled backward, drawing his revolver in one swift motion. He gestured urgently for me to move away. "Call for backup," he ordered, his voice tight with tension. His eyes were darting around the area with a frantic energy I had never seen from him before. "Tell them to send everyone." I did exactly as he asked, radioing dispatch immediately. I still had no idea what he had seen. The operator confirmed the request, informing me that 2 additional units and an ambulance were already en route. "Freeze!" Doug's shout cut through the stillness. I looked up to see him aiming his flashlight beam out in front of the Jeep. A figure stood there in the growing darkness. A man dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. He was holding something in his hand, but from where I stood, I couldn't make out what it was. Johnny, is that you?" Doug's voice carried a note of recognition now. The man lifted his head, and I saw his face clearly. Johnny, a local teenager, a native kid who had a bit of a troubled history. We picked him up a few times before. Underage drinking, marijuana possession, minor infractions, nothing that ever seemed serious. But the look in Johnny's eyes that night, it wasn't the look of some rebellious kid. His eyes were empty, sorrowful. He stared back at Doug and swallowed hard. "I have to do it," Johnny said quietly. Doug shook his head, almost pleading. "Johnny, just put it down. We can talk. We can figure this out." Johnny paused. He looked down at the object in his hand, and that's when I finally recognized what it was. A walkie-talkie. I didn't understand. Nothing about this situation made sense, but I kept my pistol trained on him, waiting. "There's no time," Johnny said. "I'm sorry." He started to lift his arm. The shot rang out. The ambulance arrived within minutes, collecting Johnny and rushing him to the town's only hospital. Doug's bullet had caught him in the left shoulder, causing him to drop the walkie-talkie. He was alive, stable, but Doug didn't carry a standard 9mm. Patrolled with a .44 Magnum revolver, that single round had done considerable damage. I still didn't understand why any of it had been necessary. Doug kept all of us away from the scene. He refused to let anyone near the Jeep, wouldn't tell us what he had found inside. We waited. Hours passed. Eventually, a specialized unit arrived from a larger neighboring precinct. That's when things finally began to make sense. Johnny's Jeep had been loaded with nearly 30 pounds of pyrotechnic flash powder, the kind used in commercial fireworks. He had packed it into roughly 2 was a bomb, a substantial one.
Further investigation revealed that Johnny's father owned a chain of fireworks stores. A search of one of the warehouses confirmed that's where Johnny had acquired his materials.
Johnny had always been rebellious, sure, but I never imagined he was capable of something like this. The bomb squad successfully dismantled the device without incident, but the entire scenario still felt incomplete. Nothing about it made sense. Why would he build something like this? What was he planning to destroy? And why did he seem so desperate, almost apologetic, in those final moments before Doug fired? Johnny remained unconscious for days afterward. The .44 round had caused more internal damage than the doctors initially realized. They assured us he would survive, but his recovery would be extensive. Doug took the incident harder than any of us. With our only suspect unconscious and unable to provide answers, the only thing we could do was return to the scene and try to piece together what it... By the time we went back, the Jeep had been removed. Myself, Doug, and 2 other officers traced Johnny's route on foot. We followed a small valley that led into a cluster of rocky foothills. There were no structures out there, no homes, no businesses, nothing that could have been a target. That was oddly reassuring in a way. At least we didn't have to worry that Johnny had been planning to hurt a large number of people. After only a few minutes of walking, following the narrow ravine, we found something. An opening carved into the side of one of the hills. At first glance, it appeared to be an old mining tunnel entrance. But upon closer inspection, I realized something unusual. It wasn't caved in. Not exactly. A large stone slab had been placed over the entrance. One solid piece. Not rubble, not debris, a deliberate seat. I found that deeply curious. The town had numerous abandoned mines dating back to the gold rush era, but they had all been shut down decades ago. We searched our records afterward and found no evidence that a mine had ever existed in that particular location. As we approached it, I felt something strange, a heaviness in the air, like static electricity building before a storm. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I noticed the same reaction in the others. Normally, that sensation can indicate an imminent lightning strike, but the sky above us was clear, no clouds, no storm approaching. Something about that place felt deeply unnerving, in a way I struggle to articulate even now. We lingered for a few minutes, examining the sealed entrance, searching the surrounding area. We found nothing else of interest. Eventually, we made our way back to our vehicles along the short trail. I don't know if it was just my nerves getting the better of me, but on the walk back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. 2 days later, Johnny woke up. Doug and I returned to the hospital to question him. He was still somewhat disoriented, likely from his medication and his condition. His father was present and initially refused to let us interview his son. But Johnny insisted. He wanted to speak with us. We were surprised by that request, but we certainly weren't going to refuse. "Where's my Jeep?" Those were the first words out of Johnny's mouth as we entered the room. "Impound," Doug replied matter-of-factly. "Bomb squad dismantled it." Johnny looked distressed by that news. Panicked, even. "We have to go back out there," he said urgently. "There's not much time." He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his shoulder. He grimaced, gritting his teeth, and reluctantly eased himself back down. His breathing was becoming frantic. "You're not going anywhere, Johnny," Doug said firmly. "Not until you tell us what you were doing. You could be facing serious charges here. What were you planning to do with all those explosives?" "The tunnel," Johnny replied without hesitation. No attempt to downplay his intentions. We have to destroy it. Doug shot me a confused glance. That mine shaft, I asked. Is that what you mean? Johnny shook his head. No, it's not a mine shaft. His eyes were wild now. His breathing had accelerated to the edge of hyperventilation. You've been out there, right? You saw it. We found it, Johnny, I confirmed. It's already sealed. Johnny shook his head vehemently. It won't stay that way. It opens every couple of days. Doug and I exchanged another perplexed look. I could tell Doug wanted to dismiss this as the ramblings of an unstable mind, but there was something in Johnny's voice, a desperate, genuine terror that made me pause. Please, Johnny begged. Tears were beginning to form in his eyes. Please. Why, Johnny? I leaned in closer. What's in there? Doug seemed annoyed that I was even engaging with what he clearly viewed as delusion. But Johnny was terrified of something real. I needed to understand what that was. I don't know, Johnny whispered. Something horrible. I've seen people post about them online. We have to destroy it. We didn't get much more from him after that. He just kept pleading with us to finish what he hadn't been able to do. He mentioned something about things coming out, which sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't understand how a seemingly normal kid like Johnny had become so obsessed with detonating an old tunnel. But I couldn't deny the odd feeling that place had given me, or the desperate sincerity in his voice. Doug and I left shortly after, realizing we weren't going to extract much more information. Later, doing some mental math, I calculated that if what Johnny had said was accurate, if the tunnel truly did open every few days, then the next occurrence would be the following morning, around 3 a.m. Doug thought it was nonsense, but I felt obligated to at least investigate Johnny's claims. It seemed impossible, I know. Doug told me I was being played, but Johnny hadn't struck me as a liar. So I decided to return to the scene. 2 other officers, Hastings and Gunnarsson, agreed to accompany me. Doug elected to stay behind, convinced there was nothing out there to find. The fact that we had to be there by 3 in the morning probably didn't help. Doug was not a morning person by any stretch. I met Hastings and Gunnarsson at the location just before 3 a.m. Both of them looked only partially awake and already regretting their decision to come. A thick fog had settled over the foothills, coating everything in a chilly dew. I pulled my coat tighter around my neck, trying to ignore the shivers running down my spine. The 3 of us sat in our vehicle, sipping coffee, making small talk, waiting. Then, as 3 a.m. approached, something happened. A sound, abrasive, unnatural. It cut through the dark atmosphere like something dragging across concrete, heavy stone scraping against stone, a loud, oppressive grinding that made my teeth clench involuntarily. It was coming from the ravine ahead of us, and somehow made the already cold air feel even colder. I could see that Hastings and Gunnarsson were unnerved as well. Gunnarsson wondered aloud if it might be a rock slide, but I didn't think the explanation was that simple. The 3 of us began making our way toward the gully. The fog seemed to be getting thicker the farther we went. It grew so dense that visibility dropped to maybe 20 yards, then less. Something's not right, Hastings said, what we were all feeling. There was a quality to the fog that felt wrong, an ill-defined heaviness within it. It didn't feel natural. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I insisted we continue. We were only about 50 yards from the tunnel entrance now. I needed to see it again. Then something incredibly strange happened. What I can only describe as a sudden head rush struck me, like my
my brain had been jump-started into overdrive. My vision began to alter in a way I don't even fully know how to explain. It was as if my perception had suddenly shifted. Little tracers began trailing off the rocks around me. The ground appeared to be breathing, rising and falling like the chest of some massive creature. I'm fairly vanilla when it comes to drug use. I've never personally experimented with psychedelics, but what I was experiencing felt eerily similar to accounts I'd read online about mushroom and LSD trips. Then, without warning, Hastings began to giggle. Gunnarsson and I both turned to look at him in confusion. His eyes were darting around erratically, like flies buzzing around his head. He had this little manic smile spreading across his face. The hell is so funny? Gunnarsson's eyes were wide as saucers when he asked. I could tell he was feeling it too. I feel weird, Hastings said, still giggling. What did you put in that coffee? Needless to say, I hadn't put anything in the coffee, especially not hallucinogenic drugs. There was something in the air itself, something messing with our minds. I made a decision then. I broke into a sprint toward the tunnel. The feeling intensified the closer I got. The world degraded into a foreign slurry before my eyes. The rocky ground became as turbulent as an unruly sea. I could barely keep myself upright, could barely decipher what was around me. Then, by some miracle, I saw it. The tunnel emerged from the dense fog, and this time, the entrance was open. From behind me, I heard Hastings' giggles erupt into a full bellow of laughter, like a mad scientist bringing his creation to life. Then Gunnarsson screamed. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. I took one last glance at the tunnel as I fled, and I swear, there was something in there, looking back at me. Something I don't even know how to begin describing. Something that shouldn't exist. I ran like I'd never run before in my life, consumed by a fear I'd never experienced. Both Gunnarsson and Hastings were no longer where I'd last seen them. From somewhere deeper within the fog, I could hear Hastings continuing to cackle like a madman, but I never caught sight of either of them. The crippling mental haze seemed to lift the farther I got from the tunnel. By the time I reached our vehicles, I felt completely coherent again. Gunnarsson was already there, standing and panting, his hands trembling. Where's Hastings? I asked as I joined him. Gunnarsson looked at me in terror. He followed after you. From behind us, I saw the fog slowly drifting outward, as if it were some singular entity moving with purpose. I no longer heard Hastings' laughter. I knew if we didn't leave right then, we wouldn't leave at all. Gunnarsson and I fled. We left Hastings behind. I called Doug on the way back, trying to convey everything that had just happened. I don't know how much he understood from my frantic explanation mixed with his own grogginess from being awakened, but he grasped that Hastings was in trouble. He and I met at the station about 20 minutes later. I went through the entire account again. Doug didn't seem to know what to make of my story, but he understood that Hastings was missing. He rallied everyone in the police force to go back and search. Everyone except Gunnarsson, who vehemently refused to return. He and Doug got into a heated argument about it. Gunnarsson eventually tossed his badge into the dirt, declaring that no job was worth going back to that place. Then he stormed off. I'll admit I was terrified of going back, but I knew we had to help Hastings. It was my fault he was out there to begin with. I had to do my part. By the time Doug and I returned with reinforcements, we found no trace of him. The fog was gone, and the tunnel, it was sealed again, just as it had been the first time we discovered it.
began organizing a search team. He ordered me to go home, get some rest, decompress from the situation. My girlfriend Samantha could see that something had happened when I walked through the door, but I didn't tell her about it. The adrenaline had finally worn off, and I felt an overwhelming drowsiness setting in. The last thing I remember is slumping onto the couch of our apartment. Several hours later, I was awakened by Samantha shaking me vigorously. "Mark, something's happening. Wake up. I feel really weird." As my eyes opened, I saw the room distorting around me, the same way it had before. That unnerving mental haze was back. And that could only mean one thing. She and I grabbed our dog, Max. Our perceptions were continuing to disintegrate as we fled. Max was going ballistic the entire way to the car, switching from snarling like he'd gone rabid to whining pitifully. It was dark again. From all around us, I could hear laughter and cries echoing from other residents in our apartment complex. I wanted to help them, but in that moment, I only cared about getting Samantha and Max to safety. By the time we reached Samantha's car, there were screams echoing from within the complex. Other residents were fleeing as well, but many were still inside. As we hit the main street, the town's tornado siren began blaring in the distance. Samantha asked me what the hell was going on. I didn't even know how to respond. I dialed Doug. He instructed me to meet him at the station, a trembling urgency in his voice. We arrived a few minutes later. I told Samantha to take the car and Max and get to safety. She had tears in her eyes, asking me what was happening, but I didn't have time to explain. I just told her I loved her and that I would call as soon as I could. She agreed. I watched her drive off, then returned to the moment at hand. Doug rallied every officer at our precinct, 9 of us total because the town is so small. He sent them back to the apartments. Only Hastings was still missing. The rest arrived shortly after. Doug explained that dispatch had been flooded with 911 calls from multiple residents of the complex. The horrific guilt of the situation sank deep into my skull, making my head throb. Everything in my mind and gut was screaming for me to get as far away from that place as possible. But I couldn't. I couldn't just abandon everyone who lived there. After all, whatever was happening, it was happening because of me. Thing had come back for me. Several people were in the parking lot when we arrived. They appeared delirious and confused. Most were in their pajamas, as if they'd had to leave very quickly. Doug ordered all of them away from the building. We began conducting interviews, asking if anybody was injured. I spoke with an elderly woman named Martha, who had lived in the unit below Samantha and mine ever since we moved in. She was all but petrified, clutching her Pomeranian tightly in her arms. Her nose was bleeding, but thankfully she didn't appear seriously injured. She held a rag to her nose, tears falling faster with every word. She told me she had suddenly been awakened by a strange feeling. She felt woozy. Since she's diabetic, she thought perhaps her insulin levels were low. But then she saw her husband sitting in their bedroom closet, giggling. She stumbled toward him, calling out, expressing her fears that she might be having a medical emergency. Without warning, her husband Frank suddenly lashed out and slapped her across the face. Then he returned to the closet, holding his knees, giggling. Martha fled after that. That decision probably saved her life. She began sobbing, saying Frank had never done anything like that before. She was worried he might be sick. I'd conversed with Frank myself dozens of times. He never would have struck me as the type of loudspeaker and instructed everyone to leave the complex immediately. We were concerned the building might have sprung a gas leak, which could possibly explain Martha's and the other residents' symptoms. But it was clearly far beyond that. Not a single person came outside. There were only maybe 50 residents in the entire complex, and most were already out. But we estimated at least a dozen were still within. 2 of our officers approached one of the entrances. The rest of us covered them. I watched their steps grow more hobbled and awkward the closer they got. Then one of them actually fell over entirely, propping himself up with his arm. He heaved and vomited on the concrete. The other officer tried pulling him back to his feet. The 2 of them managed to get back to the rest of us, their faces showing the same look of terror we'd seen on the other residents. No one went near the building after that, and no one else came out. It was just a stalemate that stretched on through the night. Doug kept on the intercom, periodically instructing people to evacuate, but no one ever did. The other residents were led away from the scene. Many were forced to abandon their loved ones still inside. Every now and then, we would hear laughter, screaming, other less definable sounds reverberating from inside the building. We caught glimpses of silhouettes within, but never anything entirely clear. No one really understood what was going on. But after the first officer's experiences and the residents' testimonies, no one wanted to risk going in there. The sun finally rose the following day. The bizarre situation took on an entirely new perspective in the daylight. It had been hours since anything was heard from within the building, but something became clear as the morning sun beamed down upon it. The building itself was different. Some spots looked almost melted. Others seemed to have elongated, grown taller or wider. It was as if the building itself was suffering from the same odd distortion that had afflicted myself and the other residents. Not long after sunrise, an entourage of black SUVs suddenly rolled up to the scene, followed shortly by a SWAT truck. Like something out of a movie, a group of men in black suits exited the vehicles and approached Doug. They spent a minute or 2 conversing. Then Doug looked back to the rest of us. Much to my surprise and relief, we were told we could leave. The men in black would handle the situation from here. By that point, I had been awake for nearly 24 hours. I wanted nothing more than to sleep. I probably should have asked more questions before leaving, but I was barely awake enough to remain standing. I assumed those individuals were CIA or from some other classified government agency, but I haven't been able to confirm that. That was about a week ago now. As of writing this, that's about where we stand. I haven't been able to return to my apartment since. Doug has informed me that I likely never will. They're considering that entire property and the 11 individuals still inside to be already lost. Doug hasn't told me much more than that. I don't even know if they've told him the full extent of what's happening. Clearly, whatever is in that building is significantly above our jurisdiction. The ravine with the tunnel is also now under the supervision of those unnamed government agents. I never would have imagined myself at the center of something like this. In some cruel twist of irony, I finally got the large-scale case I always wanted, but I never could have envisioned it being like this. Whatever was in that tunnel, and is now in that building, it's way beyond us. I want to believe there's some logical explanation. A gas leak in the mine that caused hallucinations, somehow spreading to our apartment complex. but I'd be a fool to believe that after everything that's happened. Whatever occurred to me and the others, it wasn't natural in any way. It was as if that thing invaded our minds simply by being in proximity to it. Some strange psychic aura that it possesses, whatever power it has even seemed to distort the building itself. I never got a good look at it, but what kind of entity could warp your mind simply by being near it? Just as Johnny had said, I've managed to find a few stories online of people discovering these sealed tunnels. I don't know how much of what I read was fiction, but no one seems to have an explanation for them. People apparently just stumble across them one day, often in places they've never been before. If anyone reading this has a possible explanation, please feel free to share. I'm at a complete loss. I'll admit, I've never been much of a believer in supernatural phenomena. Nothing I found online seems to explain what that thing is, natural or otherwise. Hastings is still missing. Last I heard, those people are still locked inside that building. Whatever the truth is, I just hope no more of those tunnels are out there. God knows what kind of things might come out of them. That is it for today's story. Thank you for spending some time during this night shift. Sleep well tonight. If you can,